This is CNN's continuing coverage of the Persian Gulf War. I'm Frank Sesno in Washington.
And from CNN Center in Atlanta, I'm Susan Rook. A new Iraqi surprise. Baghdad radio says Saddam Hussein has ordered his troops to pull out of Kuwait. Here is that entire radio broadcast with translation.
This is Radio Baghdad from the Iraqi Republic. Dear citizens, an official spokesman has said the following. In the name of Allah, most merciful and compassionate, our armed forces have done their combat duties in an attempt to stop the forces of evil and aggression. They have fought bitterly and bravely and valiantly, which will be recorded in the annals of history in letters of light. On this basis, and because our political leadership had emphasized its approval of a withdrawal in accordance with the United Nations resolution number 660, through its acceptance of the Soviet peaceful initiative. Therefore, orders have been issued to our armed forces to withdraw in an organized manner to the positions they were in before the 1st of August 1990. This is considered a practical and a positive response to UN Resolution 660. The spokesman has underlined the fact that our armed forces, which have proved their ability to fight and to stand steadfastly, will confront any attempt to get at it during its implementation of the withdrawal orders, and will fight with its usual bravery and valiance, which makes its withdrawal an organized one, an honorable one. The Iraqi news agency has come to know that the Iraqi foreign minister has informed the Soviet minister of this decision this evening, which is a practical response to UN Resolution 660. And he has asked, the foreign minister has asked to transmit the message from the President Saddam Hussein to President Gorbachev, in which he said, and asking him to do his good efforts and endeavor to bring about a ceasefire, to put an end to the criminal behavior of the United States and its allies and its supporters. This is Radio Iraq, the voice of the masses from Baghdad.
Now, for more on Iraq's announcement and the Soviet role in the initiative, CNN's Jeannie Mose is standing by live at the United Nations. Jeannie?
We are waiting here at the UN to see if the Iraqi ambassador to the UN or any Iraqi representatives comes here to give some sort of answer either to the President of the Security Council or the Secretary General of the UN. The Secretary General has just left for the day, but we are waiting for an Iraqi response. Here's how all this came about at the United Nations. The Soviet ambassador asked for closed consultations of the Security Council. He met behind closed doors with the members of the Council, and he told them, and this is a quote, "We have reason to believe Iraq is willing to accept immediate and unconditional withdrawal." The Soviet ambassador then went on to lay out several points, what was apparently a new Soviet peace plan of sorts, One was fix a date for withdrawal. Two was to have a very short withdrawal time frame. And the third was that there were no other conditions, that this was without any other conditions. Now, when the meeting ended, the U.S. and British ambassadors seemed very skeptical of this. They thought, why doesn't Iraq, why doesn't Baghdad send its UN ambassador over to the UN to say this himself, to make it clear? Here is some of what the U.S. and British ambassadors had to say.
The president of the council made clear that he had been in touch with the Iraqis and there was no Iraqi response. The Soviets said they had reason to believe the Iraqi reply might be constructive, but we haven't seen any Iraqi reply yet, so that's what we're waiting for.
If the government of Iraq comes forward and says that it can accept the Soviet approach, we'll have to think about it. But, and insofar as it appears in its very general terms to be rather similar to the approach of the Allies, it may not be impossible. I don't know. But we will have to see that. The first thing is to find out whether the government of Iraq is now prepared to set an early date for its withdrawal and a very short time scale for getting out of Kuwait. And in that case, we may have something to talk about.
Now, the president of the Security Council did talk today with Iraq's ambassador to the UN, but Iraq's ambassador to the UN at that point did not seem to have any information on this. And so at this point, we still don't know. We still don't have an official response here at the UN in any case. Now, Yemen's UN ambassador indicates that the first word to the Soviets from the Iraqis about withdrawing came from Iraq's foreign minister.
Mr. Tariq Aziz informed the Soviet ambassador in Baghdad of the decision of Iraq to withdraw its forces to the pre-August 2nd lines.
Now, Yemen and some other countries, for instance, India, are already suggesting that the next thing that the Council should do, if this report turns out to be true, that the next thing the Council should do is meet and somehow ensure the safety of these withdrawing Iraqi troops. As it stands now, apparently, we understand that the United States and the coalition allies are not allowing them to withdraw. If indeed they are withdrawing, they seem to be headed north. It's still unclear. It's not definite that they are withdrawing at all. But the Indian and Yemen ambassador suggests that the Council meet and somehow ensure their safety from further attack. I'm Jeannie Mose reporting live from the United Nations.
The announcement from Baghdad Radio did not impress the Bush administration. At the White House, a hardline response. Officials there stating flatly, the war goes on. A radio announcement is not good enough. CNN senior White House correspondent Charles Bierbauer is standing by. Charles, just what would be good enough in the view of the White House?
Well, the Bush administration wants to hear it from an authoritative Iraqi official. They want a clear and precise statement. The UN would be the appropriate place for that to happen. White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater says that the UN resolutions, and there are 12 of them, not just the one that is referred to in the Iraqi Radio Baghdad statement, the UN resolutions remain the guideline, according to White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater. So while there may be some indication of a change of heart in Baghdad, as you say, the White House taking a very hard approach to this. President Bush is at this moment in the Oval Office. He's returned there. He's conferring with his top security advisors, undoubtedly taking a look at this situation. No indication here that it changes the complexity of the war from the U.S. perspective, except that U.S. troops are to some degree now pursuing those Iraqi forces that may have turned towards the Iraqi border. Frank?
Charles, in the meantime, in the midst of all of this, White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater is indeed stating flatly the war goes on. This despite some of this action that we heard that may be taking place at the United Nations. Is there a feeling at the White House that it's a question of total victory now and that it simply is too late for anything resembling an Iraqi offer to withdraw?
Well, a simple offer to withdraw no longer seems to be what the U.S. is looking for. To the degree that that is true of the rest of the coalition, it's a little difficult to say from here. But one official here at the White House today said, look, Saddam Hussein could have moved the whole shebang on Friday. He could have gotten the whole Republican Guard safely back home and everything else out. All he had to do was say okay. But the situation changed after that deadline was crossed on Saturday. The U.S. feels now that it has perfect authority to go ahead and make sure that the Iraqi troops either surrender, become prisoners of war, or if they do indeed retreat, they are still fair game. That's why we are hearing that, according to intelligence reports, there are indeed some elements of the Iraqi force headed toward the Iraqi border, headed out of Kuwait, and that U.S. forces are trying to pursue them. The one thing the U.S. wants to accomplish is to take out as much of Iraq's military hardware, eliminate as many tanks as is possible. And as for the Republican Guards, most of whom are inside Iraq rather than in Kuwait, a senior administration official told me today that destroying the Republican Guards, crushing them, rendering them ineffective, is now a de facto objective since the ground war began. Frank?
Charles Bierbauer at the White House. Thank you very much. Susan?
On day 2 of the ground war, the Allies say they have scored tremendous successes against Iraqi forces, including the Republican Guard. U.S. Army airborne troops are in position in Iraq, poised to cut off supply lines and retreat routes for the Republican Guard, which is largely dug in near the northern Kuwait border. French forces thrust further into Iraq Monday, reportedly neutralizing an Iraqi army division. U.S. and British forces also pressed deeper into Iraq, punching through Iraqi defensive lines. Among those advancing into Kuwait, Egyptian forces, Syrian and Saudi troops, U.S. Marines and other Arab forces. There are reports some U.S. and French troops already have parachuted into Kuwait City. Meantime, Iraq launched its deadliest Scud missile attack of the war Monday, and the first to hit a U.S. target. A U.S. military barracks in eastern Saudi Arabia was virtually destroyed by debris from the Scud after it broke up in flight. U.S. Central Command says at least 12 U.S. service personnel were killed, at least 25 wounded, and at last word, another 40 were unaccounted for. Smoke and haze hung over Baghdad today, a sign of the Allied air bombardment on the Iraqi capital. Residents were shaken from their sleep by thunderous explosions overnight. U.S. Marine convoys were seen rolling across the sands of Kuwait Monday. Elements of the 2nd Marine Division reportedly are holding positions on the outskirts of Kuwait City as Allied forces prepare to push into the capital. Allied forces say they are now holding some 20,000 Iraqi prisoners of war. The commander of Arab forces dismissed concerns that the large number of POWs would bog down the Allied offensive. The Allies confirmed they have destroyed more than 270 Iraqi tanks during the ground battle. And in the Persian Gulf, Iraq fired 2 Silkworm missiles toward the USS Missouri and the British warship HMS Gloucester. A British Navy commander describes what happened next.
Gloucester's Type 909 radar locked on, and within 50 seconds of the initial detection, a salvo of 2 Sea Dart missiles had been fired. One missile scored a direct hit at a range of 4 miles, whilst the other is assessed to have flown through the debris.
The Gloucester has been providing cover for the U.S. battleship Missouri.
Just ahead, we'll have a live update from CNN's Wolf Blitzer at the Pentagon and more on the deadly Scud missile attack in Saudi Arabia.
Continue to advance from positions in Saudi Arabia toward Kuwait City on the Gulf Shore. Traveling with coalition forces, CNN's Brian Jenkins reports on Monday's progress toward liberating the Kuwaiti capital.
The road north to Kuwait City is now strewn with the charred wreckage of Iraqi vehicles and pockmarked with craters from the bombs and rockets that chased the occupiers away. In their wake came columns of Saudi and Kuwaiti troops exulting in the apparent ease of the Allied offensive.
Can you tell us, what was your experience? What did you experience on the first day of the campaign?
From the first day, we get a very nice experience, but we thank God we don't have any too much people injured by our army, and only I face here as a doctor in this area. Only the prisoner, they are really injured too much.
36 hours after the start of what Saddam Hussein billed as the mother of all battles, there were no Iraqi casualties to be seen on the battlefield, but Iraqi prisoners came pouring in by the hundreds. One spoke of the shame of defeat, but most seem far more relieved to be done with war than they were fearful of their Saudi captors.
And what kind of resistance did you come across? Approximately, what kind of How was the Iraqi army that you met?
Oh, the Iraqi army, you know, it's all I can tell you. All the Iraqi soldiers, you know, he don't need to fight.
Artillery fire showed some Iraqis were still putting up a fight, but Saudi and Kuwaiti troops simply watched the shells kick up clouds. And these soldiers seem more concerned about a desert snake than enemy firepower. Everyone stepped carefully around the thousands of landmines the Iraqis had left behind. The blackened hull of an Iraqi tank reminded everyone passing of the damage a buried explosive could do. Despite the months of work Iraqis had put into laying their barriers, those obstacles seemed to have hardly slowed the Allied attackers. For Kuwaiti soldiers, the forward march to reclaim their country couldn't move fast enough. This happens to be Kuwait's Independence Day, and while it may take some time for Operation Desert Storm to completely blow over, this part of Kuwait is plainly liberated. In tribute to the friends who helped win back their land, some Kuwaiti soldiers are flying the colors of coalition partners and welcoming others to plant their flags, if only temporarily, on the parcels of sand they are rolling across. Brian Jenkins, CNN in southern Kuwait.
Now for the latest developments from the United Nations, CNN's Jeannie Mose is standing by live. Jeannie?
Well, you know, the Allies, the United States in particular, has been saying that if Baghdad is serious about this withdrawal, then why doesn't the Iraqi ambassador to the UN show up at the UN and just say so, rather than this convoluted sort of way with the Soviet Union? Well, CNN has spoken directly with the Iraqi ambassador to the UN, and he has told us that he has no confirmation at this point of the Baghdad radio announcement, that he expects confirmation soon. You have to understand that there have been communications difficulties between New York and Baghdad, and the Iraqi mission to the UN has been communicating through Amman, Jordan, through the Iraqi embassy in Amman, Jordan. So the UN ambassador here has asked the Iraqi embassy in Amman, Jordan, to get in touch with Baghdad and get some kind of confirmation of this, if it's true. And he expects to be hearing from Amman, Jordan, with some sort of confirmation or denial or whatever they hear sometime soon. And when we hear, we'll bring that word to you. I'm Jeannie Mose, reporting live from the United Nations.
All right, thank you, Jeannie. And our coverage will continue right after this break.
Allied forces are accelerating the pace of the war despite Baghdad radio's announcement that Iraqi forces will withdraw from Kuwait. According to the U.S., it is very much war as usual. CNN's Wolf Blitzer joins us now with the latest from the Pentagon. Wolf.
Frank, the massive U.S. and Allied ground offensive is moving rapidly to outflank Iraq's Republican Guard. Mechanized and airborne divisions from the U.S., France, and Britain are already deep inside Iraq and may soon be in a position to block any potential Iraqi retreat. Sources here describe what they say has been an unusually swift advance that may have triggered the latest statements coming from Baghdad. The Pentagon has no immediate reaction to the Baghdad radio announcement that Saddam Hussein has ordered his troops to withdraw from Kuwait. Officials say they plan to pursue the war without change, and they say they are accelerating the Allied advance. Just as the Baghdad announcement was being made, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were briefing the congressional leadership on the first 2 days of the ground offensive.
He would have to end all hostilities, including all Scud attacks. There's no way you're going to have him get out of Kuwait and have a ceasefire if he's still shooting at Israel and shooting at Saudi Arabia.
At this point in time, we should be very cautious to go beyond anything except what is stated by those on-scene commanders, because I would not be responsible for raising the hopes and aspirations of families back here or troops in the front line.
After 2 days of the ground war, officials said U.S. and Allied forces were continuing to advance rapidly in Kuwait and Iraq. Indeed, they said the Allied war plan was moving forward well ahead of schedule.
We are continuing to attack and continue to achieve tremendous success against the Iraqi forces in the KTO. Our ground forces continue to encounter light to moderate resistance and are currently ahead of schedule in securing their planned objectives.
And General Neal says the Allies have scored successes against Iraq's vaunted, but still largely silent, Republican Guard.
We have engaged some forces of the Republican Guards and enjoy the same success that we're having against other forces.
An early exchange with the Guard resulted in the loss of 35 Soviet-made T-72 tanks. Pentagon officials say Allied airstrikes have effectively paralyzed any potential Iraqi counterstrike. And amongst some of the prisoners taken by the Allies have been some members of the Republican Guard themselves. Pentagon sources say these Republican Guard soldiers are beginning to talk, and some information of value is beginning to reach Washington. Frank?
Well, beyond those T-72 tanks that you mentioned, what late information is available as to the toll all this fighting is having on Iraqi forces?
Well, Frank, clearly the air war has succeeded in softening up the Iraqis, and now 2 days of the ground war clearly are doing a great deal of damage. More than 300 tanks have been destroyed over these past 2 days, and a lot of other damage, and U.S. officials are clearly quite pleased.
And what is the reading of how much fighting capacity remains with the Iraqi troops?
Officials here say that they're cautiously optimistic. They don't want to say this war is over by any means, but they're not anticipating any great battles, but they're ready for it if it should occur.
Wolf Blitzer at the Pentagon. Thanks a lot. Susan?
As we reported moments ago, an Iraqi Scud missile has caused death and destruction in eastern Saudi Arabia. CNN's Greg Lamont is there bringing us an update. Greg?
Well, the eastern province of Saudi Arabia is in the midst of trying to deal with restrained elation and great sorrow at the same time. Earlier this evening, at least 12 people were killed, 25 injured, 40 are missing following a Scud missile attack. It's believed most are U.S. servicemen. With more on that side of the story, we turn to CNN's Mike Genoy.
It was shortly after dark when the air raid alarm sounded in eastern Saudi Arabia, an incoming Iraqi Scud. The U.S. Central Command says it broke up in flight. The debris scored a direct hit on a building housing over 100 American servicemen. There was a huge explosion and then chaos, panic, and death. Ambulances raced through the night, and rescue workers, including many U.S. servicemen and women, struggled to pull the victims from the debris. The building was almost totally demolished.
Nothing. There was just basically the skeleton of the building. It was an inferno, and you could just barely see the frame of the building. I did see some charred bodies, and I wasn't sure if they were alive or dead, but it looked pretty bad. It was very gruesome.
Medical helicopters picked up many wounded and took them to nearby hospitals. It was the worst casualty toll from a Scud attack anywhere since the war began, and the first time these deadly missiles have killed and injured Americans. Until now, the Patriot missiles have had a remarkably good track record in intercepting and neutralizing the Scuds. Saddam Hussein has repeatedly tried to use the Scuds, largely to sow fear and terror among civilians in Saudi Arabia and Israel. He has fired them repeatedly at Dhahran, Riyadh, and Tel Aviv. The attack came nearly 2 days into the Allied ground war to evict the Iraqis from Kuwait. In general, that war has gone extremely badly for Saddam Hussein, leaving this attack horrifying but militarily insignificant as virtually the only success the Iraqi leader can claim. Mike Genoy, CNN in eastern Saudi Arabia.
Just as people were beginning to absorb what happened, came word that Saddam Hussein had ordered his troops to get out of Kuwait. Dead soldiers on the one hand, possible peace on the other. Initially, the reaction is very mixed, and at the same time, very leery and skeptical. This is what the Saudis have said they have heard before, and they say they won't believe it until they see it. Their official position is that they won't be satisfied until Saddam Hussein completely withdraws from Kuwait without condition. They say Saddam had 6 months to get out, didn't do it, and now is trying to negotiate his way out. With the official Kuwaiti view, joining me, Dr. Hassan al-Sanad with the Kuwaiti Ministry of Information. How do you feel about what's going on?
Well, we received the response of Kuwait government by the Minister of Information, Dr. Badr al-Yaqub, the essence of which is that Kuwait is used to deception and lying from the Iraqi regime and the Iraqi radio. And Kuwait will not accept any action less than the implementation of all UN resolutions and conditions set down by President Bush and other allied leaders.
Doctor, given what has been going on in the war and the scenario that has developed today, would you say that Kuwaitis in general are probably more optimistic now than ever before about possible peace coming?
Yes, we are. Because this is an indication of the defeat of the Iraqi army and the beginning of their surrendering.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's Dr. Hassan al-Sanad with the Ministry of Information for Kuwait. Again, the feeling is wait and see. There's great optimism about the possibility of peace, but for now it is when it happens, that's when people will believe it here. Greg Lamont, CNN Live, Eastern Province, Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Greg. We will take a break. Our coverage of the war in the Gulf continues right after this. Yemen's ambassador to the United Nations will be joining us next with reaction and late word from the United Nations. We'll take a break. Our coverage continues right after this.
And airborne divisions from the U.S., France, and Britain are already deep inside Iraq and may soon be in position to block any potential Iraqi retreat. Sources describe what they say has been an unusually swift advance that may have triggered the latest Iraqi withdrawal statement. Privately, officials say they plan to pursue the war without change, and they say they are accelerating the Allied advance. Just as the Baghdad announcement was being made, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and General Colin Powell were briefing the congressional leadership on the first 2 days of the ground offensive.
He would have to end all hostilities, including all Scud attacks. There's no way you're going to have him get out of Kuwait and have a ceasefire if he's still shooting at Israel and shooting at Saudi Arabia.
At this point in time, we should be very cautious to go beyond anything except what is stated by those on-scene commanders, because I would not be responsible for raising the hopes and aspirations of families back here or troops in the front line.
Officials say the Allied war plan is moving forward well ahead of schedule.
We are continuing to attack and continue to achieve tremendous success against the Iraqi forces in the KTO. Our ground forces continue to encounter light to moderate resistance and are currently ahead of schedule in securing their planned objectives.
And General Neal says the Allies have scored successes against Iraq's vaunted, but still largely silent, Republican Guard.
We have engaged some forces of the Republican Guards and enjoy the same success that we're having against other forces.
An early exchange with the Guard resulted in the loss of 35 Soviet-made T-72 tanks. Pentagon officials say Allied airstrikes have effectively paralyzed any potential Iraqi counterstrike. They say that among the thousands of Iraqi soldiers taken prisoner have been members of the Republican Guard, and they confirm the Allies have started using captured airfields in Iraq. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, reporting live from the Pentagon.
Kuwaiti and Saudi troops moved within 40 miles of Kuwait City Monday. CNN's Brian Jenkins caught up with the troops in southern Kuwait.
The road north to Kuwait City is now strewn with the charred wreckage of Iraqi vehicles and pockmarked with craters from the bombs and rockets that chased the occupiers away. In their wake came columns of Saudi and Kuwaiti troops exulting in the apparent ease of the Allied offensive.
Can you tell us, what was your experience? What did you experience on the first day of the campaign?
From the first day, we get a very nice experience, but we thank God we don't have any too much people injured by our army, and only I face here as a doctor in this area, only the prisoner. They are really injured too much.
36 hours after the start of what Saddam Hussein billed as the mother of all battles, there were no Iraqi casualties to be seen on the battlefield, but Iraqi prisoners came pouring in by the hundreds. One spoke of the shame of defeat, but most seem far more relieved to be done with war than they were fearful of their Saudi captors.
And what kind of resistance did you come across? Approximately, what kind of... how was the Iraqi army that you met?
The Iraqi army, you know, it's all I can tell you, all the Iraqi soldiers, you know, he don't need to fight.
Artillery fire showed some Iraqis were still putting up a fight, But Saudi and Kuwaiti troops simply watched the shells kick up clouds, and these soldiers seem more concerned about a desert snake than enemy firepower. Everyone stepped carefully around the thousands of landmines the Iraqis had left behind. The blackened hull of an Iraqi tank reminded everyone passing of the damage a buried explosive could do. Despite the months of work Iraqis had put into laying their barriers, those obstacles seem to have hardly slowed the Allied attackers. For Kuwaiti soldiers, the forward march to reclaim their country couldn't move fast enough. This happens to be Kuwait's Independence Day, and while it may take some time for Operation Desert Storm to completely blow over, this part of Kuwait is plainly liberated. In tribute to the friends who helped win back their land, some Kuwaiti soldiers are flying the colors of coalition partners and welcoming others to plant their flags, if only temporarily, on the parcels of sand they are rolling across. Brian Jenkins, CNN in southern Kuwait.
We are expecting the first official word from the White House to these fast-moving developments shortly. Via a spokesman from White House statement from White House spokesman Marlon Fitzwater. That's coming up approximately, we are told, 10 minutes from now. We will take a break. Our coverage will continue right after this.
War goes on. Despite reports that Iraq has ordered its army to withdraw from Kuwait, we expect to hear from White House spokesman Marlon Fitzwater in about 10 minutes. CNN has learned that large numbers of Iraqi tanks and trucks were seen heading north from Kuwait, but there is still no official confirmation of Iraq's intentions.
As we mentioned earlier, Iraq's most devastating Scud attack occurred earlier today. The U.S. Central Command says at least 12 service personnel died, 25 were wounded, and 40 are listed as missing. Rescue crews are still digging through the rubble of the U.S. military barracks in Saudi Arabia, where parts of the Scud came crashing down. With more, CNN's Mike Chenoy.
It was shortly after dark when the air raid alarm sounded in eastern Saudi Arabia, an incoming Iraqi Scud. The U.S. Central Command says it broke up in flight. The debris scored a direct hit on a building housing over 100 American servicemen. There was a huge explosion and then chaos, panic, and death. Ambulances raced through the night, and rescue workers, including many U.S. servicemen and women, struggled to pull the victims from the debris. The building was almost totally demolished.
Nothing. There was just basically the skeleton of the building. It was an inferno, and you could just barely see the frame of the building. I did see some charred bodies, and I wasn't sure if they were alive or dead, but it looked pretty bad. It was very gruesome.
Medical helicopters picked up many wounded and took them to nearby hospitals. It was the worst casualty toll from a Scud attack anywhere since the war began, and the first time these deadly missiles have killed and injured Americans. Until now, the Patriot missiles have had a remarkably good track record in intercepting and neutralizing the Scuds. Saddam Hussein has repeatedly tried to use the Scuds, largely to sow fear and terror among civilians in Saudi Arabia and Israel. He has fired them repeatedly at Dhahran, Riyadh, and Tel Aviv. The attack came nearly 2 days into the Allied ground war to evict the Iraqis from Kuwait. In general, that war has gone extremely badly for Saddam Hussein, leaving this attack horrifying but militarily insignificant as virtually the only success the Iraqi leader can claim. Mike Chenoy, CNN in eastern Saudi Arabia.
Indeed, Iraq has stepped up its missile attacks since the outbreak of the ground war. 2 Scuds landed harmlessly in the Negev desert during the pre-dawn hours Monday in Israel, raising the total of Iraqi attacks on Israel to 39. Iraq also launched 2 silkworm missiles at Allied naval forces. Its first use of silkworms in the Gulf War. British fire intercepted 1 Chinese-made silkworm, while the other fell into the Gulf.
Still to come, the U.S. troops in Iraq are getting some of their supplies flown in by women. We'll have more when we come back. Earlier today, he asked 2 U.S. Marines their reaction to today's deadly Scud attack back in Saudi Arabia and to the possibility of encountering chemical warfare.
Y'all had heard earlier when we'd mentioned that 12 U.S. military personnel in Saudi Arabia had been killed by a Scud missile attack. Does that do anything to your determination?
Oh, I think it does something to all our determination. I think the Marines are going to fight even more harder than they have been now. We're going to get the objective sooner than ever.
I think it's done that. Lieutenant Knowles, quick question. There'd been a lot of concern about chemical or biological weapons. Any evidence so far, just from your limited venue here on the ground, of any of that being used?
Right now in our sector, there's been no signs of chemical or biological warfare. However, we are maintaining our high mop posture with our mop suits on in preparation for anything he might throw at us.
By law and by military regulations, U.S. women do not fight wars, but women pilots for the first time on Sunday flew helicopters in an air assault into enemy territory. British Pool correspondent Arnott Van Linden spoke with the commander of the 101st before the historic mission.
On the afternoon before the ground assault is launched, it's time for final preparations at the staging area of the Chinooks, which will be bringing in the heavy weapons for the 101st Airborne Division the next morning. 105mm howitzers and their ammunition. All along the front lines, such work is being done, but this is a singular helicopter company. Its commander is Major Marie Rossi, who will shortly become the first woman to cross the border into enemy territory.
My tent is with my other two female officers, so we kind of, we thought it was pretty neat that 3 women were going to be across the border before the rest of the battalion was.
But she dismisses it as a special distinction. In the American Army, men and women are now equals. A major cultural change this war has made all too clear.
I think if you talk to women who are professionally in the military, we see ourselves as soldiers. We don't really put it into perspective as men versus women. And what I'm doing is no greater or no less than the man who's flying next to me or the men that are flying ahead of me.
That night, there's a final briefing inside one of the Chinooks. On the faces, one can read a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Then, early in the morning of the 24th of February, the ammunition for the howitzers is slung under Marie Rossi's Chinook. Its destination, the forward areas, the 101st have already set up deep inside Iraq. The first heavy guns and the first heavy shells to arrive in enemy territory. Throughout the day, the flights continue. Major Rossi making 2 more flights, this time with fuel. And by nightfall, a unique mission has been accomplished. Arnott Van Linden with the 18th Airborne Division in Iraq.
White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater is due here in the briefing room almost any moment. That's probably him coming shortly with the door opening behind me for a statement on the latest developments.
We continue to prosecute the war. We have heard no reason to change that. And because there is a war on, our first concern must be the safety and security of the United States and coalition forces. We don't know whether this most recent claim about Iraqi withdrawal is genuine. We have no evidence to suggest the Iraqi army is withdrawing. In fact, Iraqi units are continuing to fight. Moreover, we remember when Saddam Hussein's tanks pretended to surrender at Kafshi, only to turn and fire. We remember the Scud attacks today, and Saddam's many broken promises of the past. There are at least an additional 22 dead Americans tonight who offer silent testimony to the intentions of Saddam Hussein. The statement out of Baghdad today says that Saddam Hussein's forces will fight their way out while retreating. We will not attack unarmed soldiers in retreat, but we will consider retreating combat units as a movement of war. The only way Saddam Hussein can persuade the coalition of the seriousness of his intentions would be for him personally and publicly to agree to the terms of the proposal we issued on February 22. And because the announcement from Baghdad referred to the Soviet initiative, he must personally and publicly accept explicitly all relevant UN Security Council resolutions, including especially UN Security Council Resolution 662, which calls for Iraqi rescission
of its purported annexation of Kuwait, and UN Security Council Resolution 674, which calls for Iraqi compensation to Kuwait and others. That's the end of the statement. I might just add that the President met with his national security advisors for approximately an hour and 15 minutes this evening to consider this matter, and the President has returned to his residence. Wyatt?
Marlon, any word from Mikhail Gorbachev? Has he called the President and personally asked for a ceasefire?
We've not had any contact with President Gorbachev, although we have had contact with Soviet officials here in their embassy.
The nature of which is what, please? Marlon, the nature of which is what?
To simply inform them of our statement and to discuss the situation as it exists. Helen?
Do you consider the 12 UN resolutions and your February 22 plan as two separate entities that both have to be accepted?
As we explained on Friday, the terms of the February 22 plan, that's the one we disclosed on Friday, was a way of setting criteria for judging the 12 UN resolutions. So it is our judgment that he must still comply with the 12 UN resolutions, and the terms that set forth Friday simply give those detail.
Were those approved by the UN, the criteria, the terms of this whole?
They are the coalition's terms for describing and explaining the UN Security Council resolutions. Brett?
You have now added the condition that Saddam must do this personally. Why have you added that?
We have added this because of the nature of the Baghdad radio statement today, because of the many broken promises of Saddam Hussein, because he has not responded today concerning this withdrawal either directly to us or to the United Nations, and yet he tries or he purports to be interested in a withdrawal. And our attitude is, if that is the case, we ask him to be upfront publicly and let the whole world know exactly what his intentions are. Pascal?
What do you think Saddam Hussein is trying to do by announcing such a withdrawal?
We have no way of judging his motives. Michael?
As we understand it, the UN Security Council is meeting now or will be meeting shortly, and you're out here rejecting this Baghdad radio offer. What do you know about what they're going to be doing in that meeting that leads you to believe you can come out now and reject it?
We aren't rejecting anything. We don't know that there is a genuine offer. We see no evidence of it on the ground. We have no reason to believe the radio report. What we are saying is we hope it's true. We want him to get out, and this is a way to do it. John?
Marlon, if the Iraq's UN ambassador accepts the resolution calling for withdrawal from Kuwait and announces an Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, will the U.S. continue to attack?
The ground rules are very clear here. We are not going to attack retreating forces. They should lay down their arms and leave, and they wouldn't have to worry about that. But if they're moving as a combat units, they are still subject to the rules of war. Karen?
Yes. Can you tell us whether there's been any sign of Iraqi troops withdrawing, either with their weapons or without them?
We have no indication that there's any withdrawal taking place. John?
Two things about this withdrawal. It sounds like, one, what you're concerned about is these people possibly taking their weapons back into Iraq and being a threat from Iraq. And two, how will these people retreat without their weapons? Some of these people would be in tanks. That's how they travel, right?
They laying down their arms is simply they simply walk out. The fact is, the United States has enormous numbers of troops in that area. The coalition forces are spread throughout the country and throughout Kuwait, and we cannot sacrifice the safety of coalition forces by allowing them to have their weapons and, in effect, fight their way out, whatever that means.
You literally mean walk? You're talking about armored personnel carriers.
Well, I don't think it needs that definition. I think lay down your arms is pretty clear. Patrick?
How close are we to winning this war so that any UN action might be considered good?
Well, we are making good progress, but we certainly could not predict an end of the war at this time. A final question, Tom.
Any fashion stalling the UN action, no, Marlon? trying to see if we can win a decisive victory.
No, the UN, as I understand it, has scheduled an informal meeting for later tonight. We simply want them to know our feelings and a position on this matter as they deliberate this evening.
Well,
Tom?
What do you make of this new Soviet proposal? Did you know it was coming? And is it helpful to the coalition's aims for this to come up at this time?
I'm not aware of a new Soviet proposal.
Well, the Soviets asked the Security Council tonight to look at the proposal.
Well, you mean they proposed a meeting? That's fine, sure.
Do you feel it's helpful at this point for the Soviet Union to continue to press this proposal of theirs?
We think the Soviet Union has been helpful in this process. They have been trying to get a withdrawal. They've been trying to get Saddam Hussein to get out of Kuwait according to the UN resolutions. And in every discussion that President Gorbachev has had with us, he has reasserted his commitment to the UN resolutions. And certainly having the UN review this in any fashion is acceptable with us. That, after all, we are responding to UN resolutions. And tonight's statement would be our position going into those discussions. And this way everyone would know exactly how we feel. Dan, final question.
Marlon, is it now the position of the Allies that you all will settle for nothing less than the total humiliation of Saddam Hussein?
No, we'll settle for nothing less than full compliance with the UN resolutions. Thank you very much.
Isn't this a preemptive strike?
White House spokesman Marlon Fitzwater issuing in very harsh and unmistakable terms the U.S. response to that word on Baghdad radio that Iraq would be prepared to withdraw its troops. Fitzwater says no such official word has been given, and he says that based on any examination of the evidence, despite what we were told earlier, there is no demonstrable evidence of an Iraqi withdrawal underway at this time. Fitzwater added a new condition, that Saddam Hussein must personally and publicly announce not only his withdrawal, but his compliance with all UN resolutions. White House correspondent Charles Bierbauer is standing by now in the briefing room. Charles, this was uncompromising language, wasn't it?
Absolutely. A very, very firm position being taken by the White House, to some degree echoing what Mr. Fitzwater had said earlier in the evening, but doing so here demonstratively in front of the cameras. And that was basically that, no, they don't see an offer on the table. They don't accept Radio Baghdad as the voice of Saddam Hussein, and in fact now saying specifically that Saddam Hussein himself must unequivocally make this kind of a statement to accept the UN resolutions. And you're right to make 2 points in very clear here that had not been laid out in quite this form before, one being a personal declaration by Saddam Hussein, and the other now spelling out and citing 2 of the 12 UN resolutions. The U.S. and its allies had always said that they must adhere to all 12. The Iraqis, in turn, on their side, and in this latest Baghdad radio proposal, citing only Resolution 660, which is the one calling for a withdrawal. The 2 that Mr. Fitzwater cited tonight, 662, which would basically annul the Iraqi annexation of Kuwait, which ties into the restoration of the Kuwaiti government. And the second one, the 674, which calls for Iraqi compensation for the destruction of facilities inside Kuwait, making clear that the U.S. is not going to back away from the key elements of the resolutions. Mr. Fitzwater, Frank, also pointed out that the death toll from that Iraqi Scud missile, which hit a U.S. military barracks in Iraq, is now up to 22. Mr. Fitzwater citing the continuing Scud attacks as yet another reason why the U.S. does not believe that Saddam Hussein's forces are genuinely retreating.
Charles, it was interesting because not only was that Scud attack referenced by Marlon Fitzwater, but also the Kafji battle where some of those Iraqi tanks came in with their turrets turned around. Clearly, the U.S. is not going to take anything that Iraqi radio is saying, or perhaps anybody else in the leadership except Saddam Hussein, at face value at this time.
It would seem that way. The point of referring to the tanks at Kafji was that these tanks came out with their turrets reversed, which is traditionally a sign of surrender. And when they got into position, they swung the turrets around and fired upon the forces there, and that's how the Iraqis originally seized Kafji before they were thrown out. What Mr. Fitzwater is saying is simply, we don't trust the Iraqis. We certainly don't trust a radio broadcast. We want this thing going to be spelled out absolutely clearly. And moreover, as you and I have heard a number of sources in the White House say today, there is an opportunity here to make sure that Saddam Hussein does not have a sizable force. That's why they want them to drop their weapons, leave their tanks, and as Mr. Fitzwater put it, walk back home. The opportunity is to further reduce the military capacity of Saddam Hussein, his last chance to get his troops out intact past Saturday morning.
Indeed, Charles. And Marlon Fitzwater's first line, we continue to prosecute the war. At the White House, Charles Bierbauer, thanks a lot. When we come back, we will talk with former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Stay with us. We are joined now by Donald Rumsfeld. He served as President Gerald Ford's Secretary of Defense and more recently as President Reagan's Special Envoy to the Middle East. He joins us now from New York. Mr. Rumsfeld, you heard the White House statement there. It was a categorical rejection of an offer that Marlon Fitzwater says wasn't really an offer. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I was interested in the comments about the words and the circumstance. I kind of approached it from an entirely different standpoint, and that is the facts on the ground. If one thinks of the circumstance of the soldiers and the Marines and the airmen and the people aboard ship and their commanders and their families and relatives, we have to begin with the fact that they're engaged in a battle. And Scud attacks are still being launched. The belligerent statement that came out of Baghdad was not a compromising statement. It seems to me that it was a 3-minute decision for the president, and the first 2 were for coffee. I don't see that he had any other choice whatsoever.
Well, it would seem that what you're talking about, and in some ways what the White House is talking about now, is not so much about Iraqi withdrawal. It almost seems too late for that. It's a question of Iraqi surrender, isn't it?
Well, let me rephrase what I said. It's a fact that on the ground a battle is engaged, and to the extent there are these half offers or possible offers or questionable offers, you can't change gear. You can't stop everything and allow people to begin to move battle groups out, not knowing which way they're going, what they plan to do when they get there. You simply there are plenty of choices if the Iraqis want to get out of Kuwait. They can surrender. As the presidential spokesman said, they can lay down their weapons and begin to move out. It is not that the United States or the coalition forces are keeping them from surrendering or keeping them from withdrawing. It is simply that with a battle engaged, you have to look out for the lives of the coalition forces and the men and women engaged in that battle, and not engage in these kinds of quick responses to half-baked offers that need to be clarified.
Now, you see that there is action taking place in the United Nations, and indeed we heard from our correspondent Jeannie Moe some time ago that she expects that were there to be some kind of official notification from Iraq, that there would be inevitable pressure from some within the Security Council and elsewhere in the international community for there to be a ceasefire. Do you anticipate that will be a real problem?
Oh, I don't doubt for a minute that the Yemenis and the Jordanians and a few countries that are supporting Iraq will raise their voices, but I don't consider it a problem. Certainly no country with any forces involved would want to put those forces at risk by taking the kinds of chances that this proposal would require. So I think as I say, that the president had really no choice at all but to proceed. And until and unless the Iraqis announce that they're going to comply and begin to behave in a manner that reflects compliance.
You've seen what's happening on the ground. We've heard the comments out of Baghdad. We've also seen Saddam Hussein's track record over the past 6 months and before that. Mm-hmm. Is this sort of arrangement that White House spokesman Marlon Fitzwater just laid out something that you think that Saddam Hussein under any circumstance would accept?
Oh, goodness. You know, you never say never. If you think of what Saddam Hussein did in the Iran-Iraq War, he fought for some 8 years. Tens of thousands of Iraqis were killed. Enormous loss of life and treasure. And he ended up pulling back, striking a deal with Iran, pulling out with having accomplished absolutely nothing, and allowed the UN to negotiate it. Now, would anyone have guessed that? No, no one would have guessed it. But did it happen? Yes. Is it possible for Saddam Hussein to do what they're asking? Certainly. My guess is if he did everything else but that is to say, if he had his troops surrender, or if they in fact laid down their weapons and began to move towards the Iraqi border, he would have effectively accomplished it anyway.
Former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, thank you for your time in a timely fashion this evening. Susan?
Frank, still to come, reaction from the Pentagon and the latest from Israel. Stay tuned.
They're indeed pouring across the southern borders of their country back home. They say that they will adhere to President Saddam Hussein's promise to have all the troops out of Kuwait by tonight. That leaves only about 10 hours if that is to be implemented. We have no reports whether these troops are coming back in full units, whether they're carrying their weapons, but officials are confirming that they are coming back into southern Iraq and they'll all be out of Kuwait by tonight. They haven't said anything to the contrary at this point, Molly.
Peter, I also understand that you know that those troops are pulling back, but you also know they'll just barely be over the border from Kuwait.
I didn't get that question, Molly. Could you say it again?
I understand that you've been told that those units are pulling back to their previous positions, but those positions are just barely over the border from Kuwait into Iraq.
That is true, and from what I hear, the Allied forces have hooked around southern Kuwait to put some blocking position up. So now, will the Allies agree that southern Kuwait is the adequate assemblage point? Some of the Republican Guard are still in southern Kuwait, so the question to me is southern Kuwait an adequate assembly point, or do they have to actually come north of Basra, further into Iraq, to fulfill conditions by the Allied forces, Molly?
Okay, that's CNN's Peter Arnett reporting for us live from Baghdad. CNN's Brian Jenkins is traveling through the war zone in Kuwait. He joins us now live on the telephone. Brian, what do you have for us?
Molly, as we reported about half an hour ago, there was a radio broadcast from an unidentified location inside Kuwait from a man who we are now told did identify himself as a leader of the Kuwaiti resistance. He was warning Kuwaiti citizens not to be seen outside carrying weapons, to stay in their homes because international forces may not be able to tell the difference between those citizens and Iraqis who may decide to lay down their weapons and try to blend in with the populace. Those people were also told, and we have no way of confirming this, that international forces would be coming into the city soon by helicopter and ask those citizens not to fire on those forces. We wish we could give some confirmation from our location in southern Kuwait of the reported evacuation of Iraqi troops from Kuwait City, but at this point we cannot. If you have time, I can tell you a little bit about the damage that I was able to survey today as I drove along some coastal roads here in southern Kuwait. Molly?
Go ahead, Brian. We'll be interested in that.
Well, we drove about 15 miles north into the coastal region of southern Kuwait. We saw an Iraqi, what I believe to be an Iraqi control tower, a radio tower that was destroyed, and the adjacent command and control buildings were pockmarked with bullet holes. It seems that the Iraqi forces, in their hasty retreat, left quite a bit of their equipment behind. We saw bulldozers, and we saw huge propane tanks turned on their sides. Of course, we saw huge craters in the sand everywhere we went. We saw one crater 15 feet across. The desert is littered with shells from artillery fire, from aerial bombardment, and from big naval guns, those one-ton shells that have come in from the U.S. battleships offshore in the Persian Gulf. We passed by a coastal town that stretched for several miles. We saw beach homes abandoned and shelled, powder burns still on the outside of these homes. We saw a sleek powerboat turned on its side in the backyard of one home. Just outside the town, we saw 3 ponies running wild, the only living creatures in sight at that point. We saw dark gray smoke belching from an oil fire on the horizon near the coast. We have no way of knowing how big that fire is. We could not see flames from our positions. We also saw plenty of Saudi troops, primarily Saudi Marines, in the desert with their armored personnel carriers units scattered across the landscape. We saw Saudi soldiers kneeling in a line together and praying during the noon hour in a light rain. We saw another unit at attention listening to a commanding officer, perhaps giving them instructions on forward movement. We saw other soldiers washing up, cleaning, cooking, digging foxholes, and even one playing soccer in a field that may have been still not cleared of all the landmines that the Iraqis left behind. And we saw one unit with a mother camel and her offspring. They were silhouetted against the gray sky as we approached, and we saw soldiers feeding these camels, and one of the soldiers turned to us and called out, "Allah Akbar, God is great." And I presume on this day that the Saudi and Kuwaiti forces and the other Arab forces in the coalition believe that Allah was on their side. Molly?
Brian, have you actually encountered any Kuwaitis that you've been able to talk to in your travels to Kuwait?
We have talked with some Kuwaiti journalists who are, of course, jubilant at the prospect of the liberation of Kuwait City. We saw a number of Kuwaiti forces heading north in tank columns yesterday, flying the colors of their country.
How about citizens, Brian?
Kuwaiti citizens? No, we haven't. I believe the area that we have been able to see so far has been long abandoned by any civilians. So we hope to be able to reach Kuwait City and talk to the people there, and I'm sure they will have horrific stories to tell us.
Okay, we'll be reporting back to you. Brian Jenkins reporting to us on what he's seeing inside war-torn Kuwait.
And we'll have live reaction from the White House and Moscow when we come back.